Okay, I should start first by saying this is very, very preliminary work, and we very much look forward to your comments also on this paper. So this is joint work with one of my PhD fellows, Michaella Vanore. And what we're going to look at here is the dynamics of mainly female immigration and the evolution of gendered migration trajectories from both Moldova and Georgia. So we're changing gears a little bit here from the previous presentation. So the main point here of what we're trying to do is comparatively examine the evolution of migration from Moldova and Georgia, focusing on the changing gender patterns of migration and the different paths each country has taken regard to this female migration over time. So here we're going to look at how the changing economic needs and opportunities, coupled with the evolving political relationships with neighboring countries, have modeled this gendered migration process in each of these two countries. So really, of course, we're looking at this through the feminization of migration process more generally, and this is something that we've seen happen a lot in Eastern and Central Europe, I would say in the last decade or so. So, of course, we know that the feminization of migration encompasses more than just the increase of movements of women, right? It's also about the greater participation of women in international migration more generally, but also the changing reasons for female migration, more from previously more kind of trailing migration to now being entrepreneurs or to be pioneer migrants in their own right. And we're seeing this more and more because of very specific types of labor demand also. So in the post kind of Soviet transition, we've now seen mainly three specific waves. I mean, I'm simplifying a bit here, but three specific waves of migration coming from these two countries. So in the period that immediately followed independence, so until around the mid-90s, we saw high levels of permanent emigration from these countries, which was, of course, inspired by the severe economic decline, ongoing insecurity and conflict in these countries also, and some ethnic returns from previous movements. Then in the second period, or the second phase of migration, we saw a drop in the number of immigrants intending to settle permanently. So we didn't see this kind of large outflow of those who were really going for permanent settlement abroad. And we saw more economic migrants in search of work more generally. And during this time period, we saw that almost a third of all migrant households in Moldova had a member working abroad. And in Georgia, at this point in time, we saw some of the highest net migration rates of any country in the world. During this time period also, we started to see a small number of migrants returning from previous flows of migration. But here we started to enter an era of more circularity in the migration process. And in the third wave, we have seen a more or less steady state of high immigration. In the Moldovan case, we've seen that this has been achieved through a certain degree of migrant return and continual entrance of new migrants. So in general, we are seeing a lot of circularity in migration within the Moldovan context, but also return and more permanent return with new migrants then going. In the Georgian case, we've seen a certain amount of kind of forced return, which I will talk about in a little while, having to do more with the relationship with Russia and mainly of men that were in Russia previously. As well as accelerated migration more to the West and especially to Europe. So the current migration patterns in the two countries are largely economic in nature. They have diversified over time, and not only by country of destination, which we'll see, but also by gender. So now, in Moldova, there are, of course, different estimates of migration, and there is also a lot of seasonal and shorter-term migration. But we know that about a quarter of the Moldovan population is residing abroad, at least at some time in the year, and at least in 2010. Some estimates are higher, of course, depending on when you look at migration. Still, it is the majority of migrants are male migrants, but there's still substantial number of females. So around 40% of the migration from Moldova is also female. And we're seeing more and more that different kinds of migrants and different genders are being attracted to different countries, and I'm going to go into that a bit more. Men are definitely overrepresented in the youngest cohorts of migrants, and are mainly going to CIS countries. Women are a much larger stock of the migrant population that we see in Europe and in the EU, especially in Italy, and especially concentrated in the care sector. And this kind of economic specialization of migrants and the ways in which we see them going to different types of countries has also come with it, of course. I don't know and how far you know about the relationship between Moldova and Romania, who is now also an EU member state, but many Moldovans actually have Romanian citizenship and have gained Romanian passports, especially in the last 5 years or so. So I would say almost half of Moldovans have a Romanian passport now, which has meant that we see a larger migration stream also to Europe in a documented fashion. So in Georgia, we see that by 2010, over a quarter of the population was thought to be residing abroad. In Georgia, there are fewer statistics, and we don't know as much in general about the migration trend as we do in Moldova, where much more work has been done on migration. We do know that the largest numbers are residing in Russia, Armenia, Ukraine, Greece, and Israel. And while in the immediate post-Soviet period, men were definitely overrepresented in the migration experience, now we've seen a complete change. We've seen a switch here in what's happening. And especially when the conflict periods were happening with Russia, large numbers of men were coming back or they were deported, and now those same channels are not available to them. So the reasons that we've seen for some of these changes, of course, are both political and economic situations in both of the countries. The evolving relationship with the EU has also helped to shape these migration outcomes. Both Moldova and Georgia are members of the Eastern Partnership countries, and their relationship with the EU has also been changing over time. They were both part of the European Neighbourhood Policy, but actually now both Moldova and Georgia have signed mobility partnerships with the EU, which means that probably in the future we're going to be seeing continuing flows to Europe and more sustained. And as I said already, also the Romanian link with Moldova. So the data that I'm going to show you now, so as I told you, especially in Georgia, there's very little data on the migration situation. We recently conducted a survey financed by the European Commission to look at the effects of migration on children and elderly left behind in Moldova and Georgia. And we did nationally representative surveys in both of these countries with around 4,000 households in both countries. So these are just some of the numbers from our study. And you can see here that we did around, we have about 12,000 individuals in Moldova and about 16,000 individuals in Georgia. And so we took household information and information on each individual in that household, so we can really look at where all the migrants are and do that by gender. So I hope you can see this. All right, so you see here that we have, this is just from our data. So this is not from the data from the National Statistics Office. This is from our data mapping when migrants were leaving and their gender. And you can see that in the Moldovan case, we still mainly have men migrating from the beginning, but you already start to see a shift in the early 2000s, where more and more women are starting to migrate. And this trend is continuing. In Georgia, we see something a bit different. So from early on, women were very quickly already stepping into this marriage, into the migration situation. And it sustained itself over time, and now we see women have completely taken over, really, the migration trajectory. If we look at destination countries for both men and women, we can see that this is first for Moldova. In the case of men, it's been very clear. Male migration has mainly been to Russia. The diversification of male migration to any other country over this period since the early 1990s has just not happened. On the other hand, if we look at female migration, while there's still quite a bit of female migration to the CIS, that cannot be ignored, the diversification of female migration has increased extremely, especially, I would say, in the last 7 years. And we see now with women going much more to the EU and also diversifying their countries within the EU, even though you can still see here the predominance of Italy. This is just a different kind of representation of the same thing that I was just talking about for Moldova. So you can see still Russia plays a major role for both genders, but it's become much more diversified in the female case. If we look at the same graphs for Georgia, these are for Georgia now, you can see that, again, male migration was mainly to Russia previously, although it's been a bit volatile over time, depending on the relationships also with Georgia. And now we've also seen, in recent years, an increase to Turkey of men from Georgia. At the same time, we've seen female migration. So these are on different scales, so it might look here like female migration is less, but actually female migration is more. We can see that diversification of women has also been much more, with women going much more to this line. Actually, to you might look like Russia, but it's actually Greece. Russia and Greece both have a bluish line, but so for women, it's really they're going to Greece nowadays. Here, this gives you a better representation, so you can see it's already more women than men leaving in Georgia and spending time abroad, and that Russia is really only not a very important component at all. It's very much Italy, Turkey, and Greece where Georgian women are moving. Here to give you a breakdown, this is looking both at Moldova and at Georgia, and you can see we broke it down by whether or not they're going to CIS countries, EU 27 countries, or other countries, and you can see that this is extremely gendered. In general, you can also see that Georgian migrants are staying abroad much longer than Moldovan migrants, and Moldovan migrants seem to be much more circular and with short-term migration than Georgians. You can see also here the reason for migration in both of the countries, and broken down by where they're going, CIS, EU, or other, and then also by male and female. In both countries, you can see that higher wage, the normal things that we would think are important, higher wages abroad, and the fact that they have no jobs in Moldova. I think the more interesting thing is that we see a few differences between the countries, and the way in which migration to the CIS looks is also very, very different for the two countries, with there seeming to be more opportunities for Moldovans also there. And then if we look at the sectors of employment of migrants here, we also see that, of course, they're highly gendered, as we may expect. What I think is interesting here is that in the Georgian context, or in the Moldovan context, when we see men migrating, they're mainly working in construction. Wherever they go, men are often in the construction sector. In Georgia, it's a bit more diversified, with men working across other sectors also. And women here are working mainly in the areas that we would guess. So they're mainly working in the care sector. We're calling this more generally in household employment. And this really has to do now with the demand that we're seeing more and more in Europe for this kind of, for particularly in the care sector. So, as I said, this is really preliminary work that we're just looking at right now. And it's very clear that a lot of the political and economic relationships with Russia and the EU are critical factors in determining gendered migration patterns in both Moldova and Georgia. Previously, where men really had a clear path to Georgian men had a clear path to migrate to the CIS and to Georgia and to Russia, that has been mainly cut off now. And more we're seeing Georgian women leaving. What's very interesting also in the Georgian and Moldovan context is, of course, in this study we were looking at the effects on children and elderly left behind. In the Moldovan case, it's really mainly that middle generation that's leaving. It is mothers that are often leaving. In the Georgian context, it's not happening as much. Often it's a bit older women who are leaving, and even often a kind of young grandparent who's leaving in the Georgian context. So we already see there a bit of a differentiation in how these patterns are moving. I think we're going to continue to see these patterns over time, and we're going to see more and more of this movement towards Europe. I think even more towards Greece, to Italy, and others, where this first migration has sparked and is continuing now. I will leave it there for the moment. Any clarification questions here? No? Okay, then I